Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. I have been studying relationships for over 20 years as a couples therapist, a professor, an award-winning author, and as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend. Now, I'm inviting you into this space each week as I dig into some of the toughest and most fascinating relational dilemmas of our time. If you want to discover how to create vibrant and loving relationships in your own life, you have come to the right place. This is Reimagining Love. My guest today is Thais Gibson. She's an author, counselor, and the co-founder of the Personal Development School, where her mission is to provide individuals with a more accessible and more efficient way to heal themselves. I'm excited to have Thais on the show to zero in on one of her areas of expertise and one of the most discussed mental health topics these days, and that's attachment. Thais's in-depth work on this topic offers all of us insights into why attachment is so important to understand and why there's so much potential for personal change and development when it comes to our attachment styles. If you take one thing away from this conversation, I hope it's this. Attachment styles are not our destiny. Rather, as Thais says, your attachment style is your set of subconscious rules of how to love, from boundaries to core fears to expectations. And when we begin to understand the roots of this subconscious programming, that's when we have the opportunity to do some really transformative reprogramming, which you're going to hear about more in this conversation. I hope our episode inspires you and helps you think more expansively about your attachment style. Now let's get into the episode. Thais, I am so happy to meet you, and I'm really excited to have you here on the show with me today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here with you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to get you to nerd out with me on all things attachment. But before we do that, I want to ask you the question that I ask all guests on the show. So, Thais, could you talk to us a little bit about how you are reimagining love in one of your important relationships these days?
Yes. So I would say the first thing that came to mind would be that I am actually trying to clear space to have kids. I'm 34 and I am in a place in my life where that's something that's been like a dream and a journey, but it's almost really been that way as of more recently. I grew up being a fearful avoidant attachment style and fearing commitment and relationships and all of that. And I have a really, really wonderful husband, and I think that's been a big part of why I've really changed my views on that chapter of life, is just feeling like in a really, really stable relationship and feeling like there's someone I can really rely on, and a lot of those things. So we are in the process, not quite the end of this year, but going into next year, making a plan and reorganizing our work schedule and just sort of thinking long term about how we can position ourselves to really be able to be present with a new child and sort of recreating that dynamic in our lives. So that's sort of the new relationship that I'm reimagining. And from a personal growth perspective, it's really forcing me as well to realize that there's going to be a lot of surrender in that, because I'm somebody who likes to be on top of everything and over deliver at everything that I do. And I'm always there and show up with so much duty to my work tasks. And I'm sort of in this position in my life personally where I'm like, okay, I'm going to be not being able to sleep at the hours that I plan for and not being able to necessarily be super prepared for everything. But I think that will be good for me. And it'll also be a bit of a personal growth practice to actually surrender a little bit more to being out of control and out of routine, honestly.
I think that is going to land, I'm sure, with many listeners. I hear two parts in what you're saying. One is the fact that you are here, that you and your husband are in conversations about babies, is really a celebration of the work that you've done and the relationship that the two of you have created. So there's that part of it. And then there's the looking ahead and knowing darn well that there's going to be like some iterations of growth and evolution that welcoming a little one into your world is going to bring with it. And I think that certainly that word surrender makes so much sense. Makes so much sense. Yeah. Babies care not. Babies care not about your your sleep
Right?
rhythms and your need for a slow, gentle wake up. And
Exactly. And I'm preparing for that. So it'll be good. I look forward to it.
oh, I love it. Yeah. I remember reading once that, babies are like these little Buddhist teachers, these little in-home Buddhist teachers who give you just opportunity after opportunity to stretch into whatever it is, but that surrender, letting go of control. I think for those of us who have coped with stress by creating control, by creating order, or just those of us who are really passionate about our work and love having, protocols and timelines, it really is like there's the stretch is to create more flexibility and ease.
Absolutely. I wrote a course years ago on conscious parenting, and it was something I was really against writing because I was like, well, I'm not a parent yet. How can I write this? But we had so many requests because of the relationship between parenting and attachment styles and how they're formed. So I like pre-warned everybody when I wrote the course like, hey, this is not coming from firsthand experience and I want to be mindful about that, but I did it, almost extra research because of that to really try to sort of supplement my understanding and I sort of pulled from like of course a lot of the traditional research and then, in the studies, and then I also pulled from Dr. Shafali's work. She really dives into that concept that your child is sort of like it's not your child, it's God's child in a sense, and it's not yours to own, and it's not an extension of yourself that should be whatever you just expect it to be, but instead it's your job to like see what comes up in you, what triggers come up in you during the process of being a parent, and it will show you to yourself the entire time. So I'm definitely planning on taking that as that kind of experience.
Yes. Yeah. I'm a huge fan of Dr. Shafali's work, and she's been a guest on the show, and she is a treasured colleague of mine. Yeah. She's a wonderful teacher in that space. I remember when I was pregnant with our son, Brian, who's our first child, I got a prenatal massage. And during the massage, I had this like super strong vision come to me about this like curly haired little boy who just needed me to hold space for his unfolding. And it was like, oh, and I would try try with all my might to anchor into that vision as we were raising him, because that really, I think that is it. That Dr. Shafali writes that, children come in with their own soul signature, that they're not these little me's and but it's really difficult. I think it's so we project onto our intimate partner, certainly, but the ability to project onto our children is so strong. So I think it does, like in the best of moments, parenting offers us another deepening of our own healing to look at all of the places where we are holding on to control or fear. So, okay, I think what we're going to do here is I'm going to link in the show notes. We did an episode with Dr. Dan Siegel a while back, all about attachment, obviously. And so I want to move you and I out of the kind of attachment 101 and get you kind of in the weeds. And I've got some scenarios I want you to talk through, but I would like us to assume kind of a base of some core foundational knowledge for our listeners. So, listeners, if you are brand new to attachment styles, maybe pause here, listen to Dan Siegel, maybe dig into some of Thais's other work, and then come back for this one. But I think you're going to be able to keep up. So your zone of genius is taking these attachment styles, helping us understand where we locate ourselves, and then how that shapes our relationships and how we can change our attachment styles. So that's a real through line in your work, isn't it? That these attachment styles are not our destiny. They are not capital letters stuck to our foreheads. They are dynamic. They are shiftable. It feels like a both and. Like, this is my attachment style and it's not my destiny. So can you talk a little bit about how we can use our understanding of our attachment styles without it becoming a limiting belief?
So, the first thing is that when we look at our attachment style, I often like to use the analogy that your attachment style is sort of like your subconscious set of rules that you've learned about how to love, how to give love, what to expect, what needs should be met, how people should behave around you. So, when we imagine as an analogy that if you and I, for example, were to sit down and play a board game together, but as we sit down, you have the rules for Scrabble and I have the rules for Monopoly, no matter how much we'd like to play well at the game and have a good time together, there's going to be a lot of unnecessary friction and confusion because we have different rules for how the game is supposed to work. And so the first step in terms of just understanding our attachment style and the value and the benefit of that is that when we understand some of our own rules, like what needs we have, what subconscious expectations we're carrying and projecting onto people without necessarily communicating them, what boundary challenges we may have, what core fears or wounds we may be carrying from our own childhood and sensitivities we'll have in relationships as a result, then we can actually unpack that with awareness and share those things with our partner. So we can say, look, sometimes I'm sensitive to abandonment, for example. And so consistency is important to me in a relationship. So I can share my fear, abandonment perhaps, and the need that I have to be able to have my partner take me into consideration in that example. And so if that's there, that allows us to merge or sort of bridge the gap between having this different subconscious set of rules. You can learn me and understand my fears and be considerate of them and my needs and vice versa. So I find that to be the benefit of the attachment style. But sometimes the drawback, and I see this a lot out in the ethers of the internet, is that we then think that this is something that is fixed. And this is something that because I have this, I now just identify with this or attach this almost like another label. And the reason that's so problematic is because not only are there downsides to having an insecure attachment style and then just thinking that's how we are, and sometimes even using that as a justification for our behaviors. But beyond that, it's very easy to get into a situation where if we're not doing the work, then we're going to find ourselves making excuses for all of these different things and bringing those patterns further into our relationship. And the science of neuroscience has been around for a very long time now. And so, we can recondition our patterns. That has been known for quite some time now. It's not even necessarily cutting edge anymore. But what I've basically done in a lot of the work that I do is just given people very practical pillars to focus on for that reconditioning experience and very tangible tools and action steps that have been proven and replicated time and time again to deliver on those results so that we can truly go from insecurely attached to securely attached in a relatively short period of time. And the last thing just to add to that is that, we're not born with an attachment style. It gets conditioned into us over time through the mechanisms of neuroscience and how we fire and wire neural pathways. And so we can recondition those patterns just as they were conditioned into us to begin with.
I think you're naming a very real risk because human behavior and relationships are so infinitely complicated. I think that is part of why we're so drawn to this framework of attachment styles is it just gives us like some organization inside of our brains of something that feels quite disorganized and messy and chaotic and unpredictable. So it creates order from chaos. But I think that you're exactly right that when we cling too tightly to it, it becomes an excuse or a limitation, and it becomes really disempowering. I think it also then maybe leads us to sell, like if I'm thinking about my partner's attachment style, if I'm saying, well, this is happening because he's a dismissive avoidant, it is also then perhaps keeping me from having a relational conversation about like, what do you need from me, right? What would be helpful for me to shift in order to help you resist the urge to pull back or pull away? So it's also, I think, we not only limit ourselves, but I think maybe we also limit what we're able to ask for or expect or understand about our partner if we just kind of paint them with a, kind of one stroke of their attachment style.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that sometimes like the work, so I'll put out, YouTube videos, for example, online. And one of the things that I keep trying to sort of target and explain is, if there's informational or educational pieces to like, hey, a dismissive avoidant may have these patterns, or a fearful avoidant or anxious may have these patterns. It's not supposed to be, hey, now walk on eggshells and watch out for those patterns. It is supposed to be, hey, you can consider those things as sensitivities with your partner, but true interdependence, the best thing we're going to do is learn what are each of our fears in a relationship and what are each of our needs to be able to combat those fears. And as we're actually doing the reconditioning work, which I'm sure we'll get into a lot in today's episode, as we're actually doing the work on ourselves to rewire a lot of those patterns that we are personally carrying around our core wounds or fears in relationships and expectations and boundary issues if we struggle with them, as we're doing that internal work, there should also be external work. Interdependence isn't one or the other. We have codependency, which is like, I'm going to meet all of your needs. You're going to meet all of mine. We're just going to walk on eggshells around each other 24/7. And then we have counterdependence, which is, no, 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 you're just responsible for all of your own needs. I'm responsible for mine. Don't give me yours ever. And I won't ever give you mine. But interdependence really is that mix, that middle ground or middle way of the two. It's I'm going to do my work on my things, recondition my painful attachment style patterns, and I'm going to learn you and you can learn me. And then we can better take each other into consideration as we're doing that work. And so there's this nice benefit to having the operating manual to each other's attachment style in various ways. But if that comes at the expense of doing the inner work too, then of course that can also be problematic.
It makes me think about research that Eli Finkel did years ago at Northwestern about when somebody has a more avoidant tendency, when their partner understands, okay, my partner tends towards avoidant stuff. That means that it may take them a little while to come back around and step back in. And if I can step back and self-soothe, then they step forward more easily, right? That kind of combats that like pursuer, distancer. So he had found in his research that when the pursuer is able to step back a bit and self-soothe, the more avoidant one is able to step forward then.
One of the things that I find to be interesting is, while this is very true, a lot of people, when they're in that position, like if you ask somebody who has a huge abandonment wound from childhood because they're anxiously attached and perhaps they, were adopted at 2 years old or something along those lines, if you tell them, hey, just step back, just,
Yeah.
just give your partner space. It's so meaningful to understand that and to recognize that combats part of the problem and steps us outside of that vicious cycle that can otherwise exist in that typical anxious avoidant trap. But how does somebody step back? How does somebody do that when they are in full panic mode? Because really that abandonment anxious feeling for our dear anxious attachment styles, that's a trauma response for them. And so, what I want to share with listeners to add to that is that when we look at that, so much of the how we do those things has to do with our capacity and ability to learn how to actually self-soothe. So what's really interesting is if you take an anxious attachment style and a dismissive avoidant, for example, and they come into a relationship together, what you're going to see is that even though they'll be triggered by each other, what they actually need in order to heal the relationship just so happens to be exactly what they both need in order to heal the relationship to themselves. So if you look at that, so much of the how an anxious attachment style can just step back really exists in a few key places. The first one being they need to learn to meet their own needs. And I often give people the example is if you're starting to drive a car, when you start, you're like, oh my gosh, make sure I look over my shoulder, check the rearview mirror, turn on my signal, stay between the lines, steer the wheel. Like there's so many things to keep track of.
Right. And nothing's automatic, right? Everything is a conscious thought, a set of conscious thoughts.
Exactly. And then as you do it through repetition and emotion, eventually it actually becomes a really comfortable experience. We then are like listening to our podcast or turning on the radio because we don't have to consciously think about it. And that's when things feel a lot more effortless. Well, a lot of our anxious attachment styles, they grew up in environments where they learned to constantly outsource their needs from a more codependent space because that was the modeling they had, or those were some of the adaptive or, later on, perhaps maladaptive behaviors that they took on to deal with their environment that they grew up in. But so much of how we actually recondition the ability to self-soothe so that we can step back as an anxious attachment style is through an anxious attachment style's ability to first learn their needs from others and actually get good at meeting these needs in the relationship to themselves. Now, what I've found over time is the major needs for an anxious attachment style tend to be things like appreciation, acknowledgement, encouragement, consistency, certainty, a sense of safety and reliability, and also the ability to feel loved and wanted and have somebody be present with them and see and hear them. But if you look at an anxious attachment style, so much of why they are the way that they are is that they struggle to see and hear themselves because they're not present with themselves and they don't build themselves up. They constantly are looking for what they're doing wrong or how they should be doing more or people pleasing more. And so they're going against the ability to acknowledge or encourage or validate themselves. So a big part of like one of the first things we do when it comes to an anxious attachment style and their self-soothing is we sit down and we go, okay, it takes roughly 21 days to form neural pathways that are strong enough, they're less likely to atrophy over time. That can actually extend up to 63 days if we have wounds, usually before the age of 3 years old, sort of more of our unconscious mind wounds rather than subconscious mind. But generally, we're looking at that 21-day marker of, okay, it may feel mechanical, like when you first drive a car. Spend 21 days actively picking 2 or 3 of the top needs you're trying to get from other people and actually habitually meet them in the relationship to yourself. And when you start, it's not going to feel that great. It's going to feel mechanical, like driving a car. But usually what you'll see is by day 7, I start hearing people say things like, actually kind of starting to enjoy time with myself. It's weird. I'm not sure about this just yet, though. By day 14, they're like, wow, I actually feel like I'm self soothing. Do I still need to continue this for 21 days? And I'm like, yes,
You're like,
you
absolutely.
do.
We're not getting cocky. We are going to keep going.
Exactly. And by day 21, we've seen that needle move where anxious attachment styles can self regulate and self soothe by actually having these habituated patterns where they can meet their own needs. Now, when we combine that with also being able to do some nervous system regulation work, so active somatic work, to get more into parasympathetic nervous system mode instead of being in the sympathetic fight or flight mode if somebody pulls away, then we actually have this capacity to combat triggers when they come up. If somebody does pull away or exhibits more inconsistent patterns in a relationship, while also having the capacity to then meet our needs in the scenario that we would otherwise be relying on the other person to meet for us. So, those are really like two pillars. I have five major pillars I often teach, but needs and nervous system regulation are two of those major ones. And they very much apply to an anxious attachment style in that particular circumstance you mentioned when the dismissive avoidant tends to pull away. Okay, these are some things that the anxious attachment style can do so that they can actually hold the space and then be able to see them and their partner step out of that anxious avoidant trap vicious cycle without feeling like they're just sitting down trying to suppress themselves and clam up and just don't reach out and put my phone away and turn it off.
Right. Suppression is not a path of healing. So you're saying, okay, you're going to not do the behavior you would naturally do, which is reaching out and pursuing, but we're going to be very actively replacing that with something that is actually the medicine for this core wound. So you are really teaching people to give. And I really want to make sure we go slow enough through this part because I want to make sure people get it, is that idea of there's a very good reason why those of us who skew more attachment, there's a very good reason why we didn't learn how to offer that to ourselves because we were so busy outsourcing it from people. It was a survival mechanism in our homes growing up, was to really, really make sure we're keeping a depressed parent engaged, or we are kind of like hustling, and everything was so externally focused really for survival. So that was something that was very adaptive, right? To be pursuing and trying desperately to get the person whom we need the most of anybody in the world to tend to us. So it made such good sense back then. And thank goodness you knew how to do it back then.
And I love that you said that because that's one of the most difficult things is people often, when they learn about their attachment style, I far too often see people kind of judging and shaming themselves for their patterns. Like, oh, I am the one that calls too much and is too needy. Or, oh my gosh, I do really shut people out or get critical with my words or these types of things. And it's like, well, you have to understand that that's your body and mind doing the best that they can to deal with past trauma. And, I often give the analogy to people that if you're, walking through the forest and you see a bear and you run away and you make it out safe, but then the next day you have to walk back through the forest, your mind is constantly reprojecting the potential threat of a bear. You're like, oh my gosh, what if a bear is around this corner, over there, over there? And so what we're doing, this really bridges into another core concept of like the healing of our attachment style, is that what we are doing is we are reprojecting the fear based on the past painful experience that we didn't have the appropriate ability to properly emotionally process. So we store it as a very fearful thing. And then we reproject it into the future as a form of self protection. And so, what we end up doing and what we see for each attachment style is that each attachment style has specific core wounds or fears. You'll often see, and the very obvious ones, is that the anxious attachment style has big core wounds around feeling abandoned, alone, excluded, rejected, disliked, unsafe if somebody pulls away, unloved. So those are really, really big fears that they'll constantly reproject, kind of like the bear analogy. Dismissive avoidance, their big core fears or wounds are I'm going to be unsafe if I open up, or I'm too emotional or vulnerable. I am going to be seen as weak or defective, AKA shameful in that case. I don't belong, or I'll be trapped, helpless, and powerless in the wrong relationship dynamic. And that's because they grew up in childhood emotional neglect, where that was their experience and what they saw a lot of the time, combined in very many cases with enmeshment. But enmeshment with the parent is still a form of childhood emotional neglect because you have the one-way relationship with the parent. And fearful avoidance essentially share in those two sides of the core wound. So another big pillar of focus when it comes to reconditioning our attachment style is having the ability to reprogram those core fears and wounds so that we're not constantly on high alert, as if we're in that forest on the lookout everywhere we go for the fear of those wounds recurring.
do what you did now for the fearful avoidant person, because you were talking about how for each of these, for the more anxious partner and for the fearful avoidant partner, their healing comes by really giving what they most need to give themselves is something they can now seek in the relationship. So for the fearful avoidant person, what are they giving themselves and what is their nervous system regulation so that they can resist the pull of avoidance and remain in connection even when they're feeling a bit uneasy, unsteady, vulnerable?
So there's 5 pillars overall that I always take people through. And this is actually how we go from insecurely attached to securely attached. So the first is really to reprogram those core wounds. And I'll definitely share a tool in a little bit for how to do that. So if we're constantly fearing being abandoned or trapped, that's such an uncomfortable feeling in your body when you have those wounds come up. And that doesn't have to be something we carry from relationship to relationship to relationship. So, number one is to reprogram your core wounds. Two, that we covered earlier with the anxious attachment style, was to learn to meet your own needs and regulate your nervous system. And then we sort of have the external person to person work, which is that's really internal work. Recondition my core wounds, meet my own needs, regulate my nervous system. And then with people, I have to learn to set better boundaries. And I have to make sure that I'm in a position to be able to communicate my needs to other people as well, because that's a really big piece of healing. So, for the fearful avoidant, just touching on those 2 pillars that we touched on with the anxious attachment style, being the needs and the nervous system regulation, the big thing for a fearful avoidant that's so important for their healing is number one, their ability to stop betraying their own trust. So, to actually meet the need for self trust, I think that it's very underrated how often fearful avoidance basically oscillate between codependency and counterdependence, where they will be there for other people to the nth degree at the expense of themselves. And then they'll burn out and they'll shut down and really often shut everybody out, like push people away very strongly when they're in that space. And so what happens is fearful avoidance will often say yes when it's a no for them, or they won't actually show up and be congruent for themselves with the boundaries that they have for themselves or the things that they're going to stick to. So one of the biggest things that they have to work on in their healing when it comes to their needs is, let me make sure I actually know what my true yeses and nos are, that I honor
Before
those
I say
things.
something. Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
And that happens when we learn to take ourselves into consideration rather than moving from this compulsive space of like, somebody asked me something, it has to be a yes. My friend asked me to come over all weekend and clean their house for them. Oh, I don't want to be a bad friend. It's a yes immediately, before I pause and I actually consider myself and think of, well, is it a yes or a no? Or is it somewhere in between? Maybe I stop by and bring my friend
For an
breakfast because they have a
hour.
lot of
Yeah.
work to do. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. So
Mhm.
they have to really relearn the art of taking themselves into consideration. And guess what? One of the biggest needs is for a fearful avoidant from other people to be considered. So it's a big need in the relationship to themselves. So to be considered, considerate of self, to have some ability to actually honor their boundaries, their true yeses and nos. Again, such a big need for fearful avoidance from other people, although they are not often communicating those things. And other big things that fearful avoidance tend to really need and seek from others is to be seen and heard, similar to the anxious side, to make sure that they feel like they are important and a priority. Again, fearful avoidance have that anxious side. And so those are things they have to learn to meet within the relationship to self. I find that a lot of fearful avoidants think that they are meeting that because when they are burnt out from other people, they'll retract. But if we're doing things from a place of burnout, we aren't doing them properly. If we're doing things because the straw that broke the camel's back, now I have to, hide from the world for the next 3 months. Well, then you didn't consider yourself proactively. So it's still a great place of work. And then, similar to the dismissive avoidant, fearful avoidants have a very big set of needs for freedom, independence, autonomy. And again, often when they move from a place of codependency, they dishonor those things. So they have this sort of both sides to them in a
Yeah, a little bit of a
sense.
blend. Mhm.
Exactly. But especially those unique ones around trust and not being betrayed. In other words, considering yourself so that you don't end up in that space of betraying yourself. So, what we would see in this particular case is that fearful avoidants make time to meet these things in the relationship to themselves, especially the need for depth, because they need a lot of depth and they'll often seek that in their external relationships, deep conversations, know everything about somebody. But they have to learn to truly know themselves and truly understand their own patterns and why they are the way that they are. And again, when they meet these things in the relationship to themselves across that 21 days, and they're showing up for a couple of needs at a time for a 21-day segment, then they also increase their ability to self-soothe. And when we pair that with a nervous system regulation activity like daily breath work or meditation or mindfulness practices, especially the first hour that we wake up or the last hour before we go to bed, because our brain is producing more alpha brain waves at that time, then we have a greater capacity to recondition these patterns that our body has learned for so long to constantly be in sympathetic nervous system mode. So having something to downregulate us, practicing that in a suggestible state, which is, very meaningful in terms of how quickly it will move the needle to recondition our patterns, are two of those pillars. But to be honest, I find the biggest and most important pillar for fearful avoidance is reprogramming core wounds.
When we were talking about that example of the dismissive avoidant and the anxious person, what is a dismissive avoidance? Like what do those pillars look like for the dismissive avoidant person's healing journey? And are they the ones that are hardest to do you have them in your school and with you? And is it the hardest to kind of have them turn towards this work? Do they tend to be the toughest customers for you?
It's a great question. I was in private practice first for quite a while. So I worked with people basically for 10 years. There was an overlap at when we started PDS as well, but I spent a lot of time seeing clients as well, like one-to-one in the past. And it's interesting. I'll tell you an actual stat. So I can look in the back end of, like, we look a lot at our analytics, right? In the personal development school. And only about 20% of students who come in there are dismissive avoidant. But believe it or not, the 20% of dismissal avoidants who are in there, they actually watch the most hours of courses and they are most likely to complete courses in full. So I find them to be very dedicated, quite honestly, to the work. But of course, you're going to see less likely, a smaller likelihood that dismissal avoidants are going to end up in this kind of space because so much of their persona has been built around not facing themselves, right? I don't want to feel my feelings. I don't want to, go into any kind of interdependence and have people rely on me or vice versa. So, less likely to be there, but
when they're there, they're there. Do
exactly.
you think that they oftentimes are there because somebody has encouraged them, like their partner or a friend or a sibling has encouraged them to turn towards your work? Do you think that they start off a little bit more reluctant?
I would actually say less so. That can happen for sure. But I find them to be, I think you'd be surprised. I think there's a lot of like a bad rap on the internet for dismissive avoidance. But even like what I would see with clients, they're slower moving. They're a little slower to get stuck in. They really need to take the beginning time of doing some sort of work to establish trust, honestly, to establish like this makes sense to me logically and rationally. I can see myself doing this. And when they have this sense of safety and comfort and sort of cross that threshold, they show up extremely well as clients, as students. Like they really are quite dedicated. So again, you're less likely to see them be there. And yes, sometimes partners will have them come in, but again, dismissive avoidants don't really respond that well to the ultimatums, like the partner saying, you better go and do this.
Right.
They're
No,
very
none of us
independent,
like
yeah,
that.
in their choices.
Uh-huh.
But I have seen a lot of dismissive avoidants come in because of hitting a rock bottom in a sense, in a relationship or feeling really stuck or confused or feeling like, what, even at work, I'm finding myself affected by certain things. And so it's usually from that space that they'll move into a commitment of doing the work.
So if somebody who is dismissive avoidant is partnered with somebody who's more anxious, what does their healing look like in the context of that partnership?
Yeah, I always give them the 5 pillars, always. So they're each going to do some work on their individual core wounds first. If it's okay, I'll share maybe a tool for people
Please
for
do.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think this is like
Yeah.
such an important one. And again, it's because we have these painful fears and they're the biggest triggers that come up in our relationship. So for anybody who's less familiar, a core wound is basically whenever we have a painful experience, a small T trauma that's really repeated, so it fires and wires constantly, or a big T trauma that can imprint the subconscious mind more immediately. And so whenever we have a core wound because of a painful experience that we can't process, we make it mean something so we can protect ourselves from it in the future. So just a very obvious example, let's say somebody grows up with extremely critical parents. The parents really mean well, they intend well, but they're constantly, putting the child down, to prepare them for the external world or whatever it might be. The child may make it mean, okay, well, I'm not good enough. And so we carry that wound or that idea about ourselves. we come to identify with that almost as if it's a part of our personality. And those in later life will be the biggest things that trigger us as adults. And of course, we can definitely acquire core wounds later in life as well because of painful relationships or traumatic experiences that happen later on. But in childhood, especially for the first 8 years of our lives, because our brain is producing more alpha and theta brainwaves and later on, we're basically in a state of hypersuggestibility, which is a state that you need to be in order to be hypnotized. And so we're just sponging everything up at a very young age. And that's where a lot of our core wounds really start off from. So if we look at these big wounds, these big fears in relationships for fearful avoidance, like I'll be betrayed, abandoned, trapped, unworthy, seen as bad, or anxious attachments, I'll be abandoned, alone, excluded, disliked, etc. What we have to do here is realize if you're sick and tired of feeling this way, you just have to stick to one thing for 21 days. It's actually going to change this pattern. Now, a lot of people, when I say that, are probably thinking, oh, I'll do 21 days of affirmations. Affirmations mean nothing, in my opinion, because affirmations are your conscious mind speaking to your conscious mind. The problem or pain point that exists when you have a core wound, it's not conscious. Nobody's waking up on Sunday morning like, I'm going to tell myself I'm not good enough all day and see how I feel. These are subconscious. These are autopilot programs. They're pre-existing. You are not choosing them. You wouldn't choose them if you could. So what we have to realize is we have to talk to the subconscious mind in our effort to recondition or reprogram. And the subconscious mind doesn't speak language. If I say to you, for example, whatever you do, do not think of the purple elephant.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you probably heard do not, but you probably still flashed an image of a purple elephant. And that's because the subconscious mind speaks in emotion and imagery. So we need to leverage that if we're trying to recondition our subconscious wounds. So what I get people to do is 3 steps. Okay. Step 1 is to find the wound and its opposite. So I'll be abandoned. I'll be connected. I'll be betrayed. I can trust. I'll be alone. I will stay in the company of other people. Like just something that really sits with you. And we'll just use for ease sake, I am not good enough. Okay. So what's its opposite? I am good enough. Step 2 is we need to speak through emotions and images to our subconscious mind. And we need repetition because it's part of what fires and wires new neural pathways. So what we do here is we leverage memory because every single memory we have is actually a series of emotions and images. So if you were to think of a favorite childhood memory and it was you playing at the park with your friends, you would see the images of the park and the grass and the slides. And we've seen, many times when people retell an old story or memory, they laugh or they smile or they remember it and the emotion is there. So what we need in step 2, after we find the opposite of the core wound, I'm not good enough, I am good enough. We need 10 pieces of memory, 10 times that we actually felt good enough. They can be very small. They don't need to be like huge accolades. They can literally be things like, I got out of bed at my first alarm this morning. I didn't snooze it. It could be like, I made it to work on time and I showed up well for a hard conversation with a coworker. These small things. And then once we have those 10, we record them down. So into a phone or even just write them out so that we can reread them. And for 21 days, we reread them or listen back to them if we've actually spoken it into our phone or a device. And we really focus on feeling about it as much as we can when we hear it. And we focus on leveraging the images of those memories. And ideally, if we do this in the first hour that we wake up, or the last hour before we go to sleep when our brain is producing more alpha brain waves, we are more suggestible. So if we listen in those time segments to the opposite of this old idea, I'm not good enough, no, I am good enough. Here's the 10 pieces of evidence or memory for why. Feel about it, see it in your mind, leverage your senses as much as you can in the memories. We're actually using our conscious mind to speak to our subconscious mind in a way that will fire and wire new neural networks and over that 21-day period eventually solidify.
Oh, I love it. It's so empowering. It is not talking back through the trauma. It's not reliving. It is really such a beautiful, empowering process that is based on all of the neuroscience. I just came back from a 4-day conference in California and I'm just like flashing on all of these different workshops that I did. And there's many of the themes, come through in what you just described. So I love it. I love it.
Yeah. So I think you asked earlier, you said, okay, between the anxious and the dismissive, like what are things that they can do? And the first thing that every attachment style needs to do is do some work on their core wounds because those are the biggest triggers that cause the most interference in the relationship. Those are the
So
things.
you're saying, right, that 21 day, that practice is really designed to kind of to tend to heal and quiet down the core wound.
Exactly, and really recondition that pattern. And so then if we pair that with us each learning to meet our own needs so that we have the ability to self-soothe, and we practice that for 21 days after that 21 days of doing some core wound work on one or two wounds at a time, then we'll start reducing our triggers in relationships, upregulating our ability to self-soothe, down regulating our nervous system into a more rested state and in parasympathetic through daily practice. And yes, these are not overnight things. You've got 21 days of the core wounds, 21 days of the needs, 21 days of doing some nervous system work. You can do some of them at the same time, of course, if you're really like in the work. And then we really get into the practice when we're not coming from as triggered of a space, when we have the ability to self soothe and regulate our nervous systems more. Then we really go into practicing healthier communication of our needs to each other so that we can be loved in a deeper way. I'm a big believer that one of the most important and impactful ways that we actually feel and experience love is through our ability to communicate our needs. You've probably heard of like Dr. Gary Chapman's 5 love languages. And, we have these 5 love languages and those are amazing, but they're honestly umbrellas. Like, I'll give an analogy. So, I have a big quality time love language. That's a big thing for me. And I love to sit and chat and hang out with somebody and be present. And for me, if I spend quality time watching television with somebody, versus having a deep conversation with somebody, there's a huge difference. And the reason is because I have a big need as a person for emotional connection. So love languages are meaningful and they're great pointers, but we understand our needs in relationships and we can meet them with ourselves, but then also meet them with other people. It actually lands much more deeply than just love languages. So, after we've done that inner work, reprogram your core wounds, meet your own needs, regulate your nervous system, we then move into, can I communicate my needs to my loved ones and practice receiving them and meeting theirs so I can make them feel more loved? And can I make sure that I learn to have healthy boundaries so I can also keep my sense of self? And those are big, 5 big set of, I think of them as sort of pillars in the work to become securely attached. And that, of course, blends into what a dismissive, avoidant, and anxious attachment would then do with each other.
Wonderful. I have a scenario for you that I would love for you to kind of talk through from an attachment framework. So let's imagine Rachel. She started her own therapy after a series of relationships that ended poorly. And she's become much more aware of her patterns and her tendencies. She identifies as anxiously attached. And she was in a new relationship and feeling much more kind of anchored and sure, and then found out relatively early on that her partner had cheated on her. So now she's feeling blindsided, she's feeling hopeless, and she's struggling primarily with a feeling of self-trust. Like, I thought that I had done this work. I thought I had chosen differently. So what would you want Rachel to keep in mind through an attachment framework?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful share. So the first thing is to be compassionate with herself. I often give people this framework, ICA, like inquire, have compassion, and then be accountable. So, this dynamic of, what was sort of the root cause in this experience? If I can seem to find one, is it that this person was emotionally unavailable and maybe I could have vetted them a little bit more at the beginning to see. Maybe I ignored some red flags. Is there anything there? And one of the other big checkpoints for people I often give is to do some shadow work. So sometimes when we see a series of patterns and we find ourselves constantly in those types of relationships. So, for example, if I were to always choose somebody who cheats, and that's in almost every relationship, I often ask people, okay, let's turn that inwards and do some shadow work and look for, is there anywhere I'm cheating or cheating on myself? In other words, sacrificing my needs in favor of other people or trying to become a chameleon and be what I think people want from me. Are there places that I'm doing that? Because what's really interesting is there's a lot of research to show that our subconscious mind wants to maintain its comfort zone. So what's most comfortable to us is people who treat us the way that we treat ourselves. So if we have a history of seeing the same patterns in external people we're in relationship to, a great checkpoint becomes, okay, let me just go inwards and see, does that mirror back a way that I treat myself sometimes, and clean up that pattern. However, we also can't necessarily control what other people are going
No,
to do.
right.
so,
That's right.
the first place is I always look to inquire, is there anything in me where I could have vetted more? I could have had harder conversations to see if there were red flags. Did I filter things out? Is there a shadow work piece in here? We do that work because we can control that. And that can help us on our healing and our growth and our self-awareness even. And then the second part becomes compassion. Have some compassion in the relationship to myself. And then how can I be accountable moving forward if I do have some unhealthy patterns in there? Or how can I make sure that I'm really taking the time to vet more effectively in the future? And then the last part, because that's sort of a framework to cope with the situation, but also we want to make sure that we're not letting new situations and experiences leave us with core wounds. So if we think, hey, we've done some healing, but then somebody betrays us, the last thing we want is that because somebody betrays us, now we take that with us everywhere we go and we project that into every relationship we have, because you know what? Then the person who betrayed you, they're out doing their life and they're moving on and maybe cheating on other people. And you're here worrying about that in every relationship over and over. And that's the real trauma of trauma, is that because it gets ingrained into our own subconscious mind and we reproject it into everything, it has the capacity to almost be like your ex who betrayed you is running your mind over and over again in the future. So I always say to people, like, do the core wound reprogramming so that nobody's leaving little weeds in the landscape of your subconscious mind because of their behavior, not yours. And then take something away in terms of, here's what I'm really going to look for in the future with somebody, so that I can make sure if I see any incongruencies, I talk about them earlier, perhaps, or I vet very clearly to make sure that the people I'm dating, may have no history of cheating. And of course, we can't control everything. We'll never know for sure, but let's look at what we can check in with. Let's do that work. Let's have some key takeaways in the future. If we do find something, let's have that self-compassion and let's continue on our journey and make sure that there's no weeds from anybody else left behind.
Wonderful. Okay. I'm about to wrap you up and let you go on your way, but will you just talk to us a little bit about the Personal Development School and how, do you find it to be an adjunct to individual couple therapy, a sort of precursor? Like, when do you find is the best time for somebody to kind of add work with you to whatever they're already doing?
Yeah, so it can be either. Often I find that if individuals have been through big T trauma, some really extreme trauma in the past, I definitely think it should be something they do in tandem with therapy, because having that one-to-one support can be really valuable. But the core of what we teach is how to treat your attachment style specifically at the subconscious level, because it is just a subconscious set of rules and patterns and fears. And so we essentially run these 90-day or so boot camps to really get started on, like, hey, here are the tools, here's the momentum that I can build in terms of rewiring these patterns, get some work in on those core wounds, the needs, the nervous system regulation. And then after that, I can continue past that and say, okay, now let me do that external work and practice my boundaries and communication. And that's where we see the ability for people to really move through their relationships. And so our school has these sort of boot camps. They come in course format. And then we have daily support. So we have counselors, coaches, and peer support groups twice a day so that people can kind of come in and ask questions and really do that work for themselves. I started my practice originally at one point from the lens of hypnotherapy. I started doing a lot of work in hypnosis with people originally. And it was such a, like, give the man a fish experience rather than teach the man to fish.
Mm-hmm,
so
sure.
so
Yeah.
so much of this for men and women is like, no, 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 here's how your subconscious mind works. Here's how you can reprogram it. Here's the user manual, so that people can take those tools with them for a lifetime is the goal.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. So we'll link in the show notes, but what's the best way for people to kind of dive in to your work? Is there a particular place they should go?
Thank you. Yeah. So people can take a free attachment style quiz and get like this really in-depth report about all their core wounds and patterns at personaldevelopmentschool.com. But we also have a YouTube channel, and I put sort of daily content out on there. It's personal development Thais Gibson, and a podcast too under the Thais Gibson podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you, Thais, for taking the time. It was really fun to learn about the work that you're doing. You are a powerhouse. You're a rock solid teacher. So this was really, really fun to connect with you in this way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful and really appreciate our conversation.
Thank you, Thais, for joining me today. I love how optimistic Thais's work is when it comes to attachment. She invites all of us to examine our current attachment styles with a lens of curiosity rather than sinking into shame or feeling doomed. And you know I'm so on board with this approach. If you are interested in checking out Thais's personal development school and her book, head to the show notes where you're going to find all of those resources and more. Until next time, be well. Thank you for listening to our show. Our producers are Elizabeth Vogt and Mary Chan and Katie Paggage of Organized Sound Productions. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. The show is executive produced by me, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.